Does Shazam Fury of the Gods, Shazam 2, even matter? Should we even really care about the second adventure of a second-tier character who audiences didn't even show up to really support the first go-around, and whose future in the DC movies is likely in flux given James Gunn's soft reboot of the now titled DCU?
I'm an idiot.
Logic would tell you no, Shazam 2 doesn't matter. However, art doesn't necessarily need to justify its existence. A movie can be fun, compelling, and great, even if it has little bearing on the future of its respective franchise. The problem is, I'm not sure Shazam 2 is confident enough in its own existence to be anything other than lame, forgettable, paint-by-numbers superhero fare. It sadly feels as though the film heard all of your apprehensions towards a Shazam sequel and just kinda rolled over and showed its belly. It's just pitiful. The first Shazam was a great movie. I mean, granted, it's not one that I went bananas over or revisited a bunch, but it's a movie that I quite enjoyed. It was a real Amblin-style take on the superhero genre, allowing us to feel like a kid in the body of a full-grown man. The magic of that made everything just work. But with this sequel, something is a bit off. These characters have had so much time between adventures and grown, but Billy doesn't feel like he's changed. If anything, the way Zachary Levi plays the character in this film feels a bit more immature, though he is grappling with a very real problem. Billy's suffered a lot of trauma at a young age, rejected by his parents, the system, and now the city he's trying to protect. Even the public isn't sure if Shazam and the Shazamily are really amounting to much good. They're still just kids playing dress-up with powers they don't fully understand nor seek to understand. Now, obviously, we don't need or want Billy to be dark and brooding the whole time. Shazam is a character who has fun, but also there's a very serious core to this character. Billy is facing down aging out of the foster system and the fear that comes along with that. He's clinging on desperately to his family because he doesn't want to lose them. Billy trying to coach the family, trying to force the rule that they all act as one instead of one acting for all. But they aren't interested in always acting as one unit. They have their own individual pursuits and interests.
That's what happens when you suck!
Billy's holding on too tight. Freddie wants to fly solo. Mary wants to go to college and find herself. An arc that sadly doesn't really go anywhere beyond lip service, which is a bit frustrating considering it's one of the most compelling aspects of this movie, and it's just like, yeah, I'm really mad I didn't go to college, and that's it. We never... What? What's interesting about this is the fact that it contradicts the very nature of the Shazam power, which is eternal. He's a bit like Peter Pan, not wanting to grow up and having the means to follow through with that, but at what cost? The whole crisis of identity in the film feels rooted in the creation of the character, too. Shazam is such a strange character where he's caught between myth and a compelling idea of child wish fulfillment. There's a really fine line you have to walk, otherwise you lose the character. I think for me, the mythology stuff is cool, it gives it a nice little Percy Jackson flair, but it comes at the expense of a more personal story. Not saying the core of the film isn't personal, it is, but it gets muddied by all the moving pieces and lore and monsters and dragons and fucking cyclops and minotaurs. What I loved about the character of Shazam is the fact that it's a boy coming of age as a superhero. It's someone who gets these remarkable abilities and turns into a man, a god in the first one, yet he has the mindset of a kid. He has to go through growing pains while he's living inside the body of someone significantly older than him. He has to learn the value of family and use his powers responsibly to protect the ones he loves instead of, being a self-serving asshole. In the second film, he's trying to control it all because he's afraid. He's afraid of growing up and having to go through changes. It's a beautiful story of maturity and self-discovery, and I think it would have hit harder had he just simply been the hero of Philadelphia. Keep the same level of groundedness of the first one, but maybe just add in a dash more of the mythological elements instead of a whole damn meal of it. Instead, Fury of the Gods suffers from classic sequelitis. Stagnant characters, a plot that tries to one-up the first film but seemingly in spectacle only, and a combination of elements that just kind of lead to an film. It's nothing terrible, but it's certainly nothing great or as special as the first Shazam. And even though they're crucial to these films and their identity, a big part of what's dragging all of this down is the Shazamily.
Oh, hey.
Ultimately, the worst thing this franchise did was keep the Shazamily as heroes with abilities. Yeah, Fury of the Gods is basically saying, hey, Billy, maybe your family didn't want this. Maybe they wanted to choose their own path. You can't control everything because you're afraid they'll leave you. But at the end of the film, they just forget the lesson learned and Billy restores the powers to his family after it's been stripped from them. I don't know, it just feels a bit inconsequential. Like, what was the point of all that if you're just gonna give them their powers back anyways? It didn't seem like anyone outside of Freddy really wanted them. And so the ending of this film just fizzles out like a wet fart. All of the weight and lessons learned just sort of dissipates. I'm not even talking about the fact that Billy gets resurrected by Wonder Woman. I think that's fine, and it's neat that the heroism of an orphan, a boy, a human, a god, saved an entire realm because he acted with love for his family in order to protect it. But I wouldn't necessarily say the characters have grown the way the film seems to insist they have. There's a general through line of fear and how that dictates action throughout the film. Calypso acts out of anger for what happened to her father and how their power was taken from them as they were trapped inside of a dome. Her hate comes out of fear of losing her family and her home, but her fear negatively dictates her actions to the point where it corrupts her as she turns on the siblings she wants to protect. Billy is also afraid of growing up, losing his home and family. Just like Billy has to learn to come into his own as both Billy and Shazam, he has to let his family do their own thing, let them fly. I feel like there's a lot of room to explore this idea of his siblings wanting to go off and do things outside of being a Shazam or whatever, or in the case of Freddy, be a Shazam on his own, prove he isn't as broken as he fears he is, and Billy's still clinging to that. Especially with the backdrop of Philly, it feels like there could be this whole kid in a big city thing going on there. Like how Peter moves to New York City after graduating and stuff in Spider-Man, and then maybe in this film, Mary moves into the city to go to school since she opted to not go to California. There's a lot of stuff they could have done to take advantage of the setting this movie takes place in, but they don't seem too interested in that. The reason Billy clings so strongly to his family being a part of his superhero life is because he's insecure about the fact he doesn't know what he's doing and needs his family, or more specifically, Mary, to help and tell him what to do. And the irony of this whole thing is it feels as though the filmmakers don't exactly know what they're doing with this story, other than, oh, Billy's struggling with growing up, and yet he's also Shazam, and the classic superhero identity crisis of wanting to be a hero but having their own personal wants and desires. It's like they had a kernel of an idea for what a possible Shazam sequel could be, or really just a Shazam movie could be, and then tried to run with it as far as they could, but they never could fit all these pieces together and bring it all home in a way that felt satisfying and compelling. And part of why that is because there's so many moving parts, there's so many characters that need to be balanced. There are 3 villains that need time dedicated to them being fleshed out, and there's this whole mythic aspect of it that takes away from the core theme being explored here. But I digress. Anyways, Billy needs to grow, fly, separate from the group to make them stronger when they come together. The differences and individualities is what makes people stronger in a team dynamic. This is a great contrast to Calypso and the Daughters of Atlas following the thread set forth by their father and the rest of the gods. Are they going to be the same, or will they set forth a new precedent? Again, this is another opportunity for solid meta commentary on the very nature of Shazam as a hero himself. But the problem is, Shazam as a character and the world he exists in is only defined in opposition to what already exists. If those things like Superman or Wonder Woman didn't exist, what would Shazam be? Ironically, this is sort of the question the film is asking but never really answers.
It doesn't matter.
Whether it's fair or not, Shazam is basically seen as Superman and Wonder Woman and all of that. And so these movies market themselves as those kinds of things instead of, hey, this is a Shazam movie. Because at the end of the day, Shazam Fury of the Gods feels more like a Wonder Woman movie, a Wonder Woman story, with a character going through a Superman-esque crisis. The joke is that Shazam is a Superman ripoff, hence the main concern with the character, but perhaps you shouldn't highlight that? I think people would have been willing to give Shazam a try regardless of comparisons by your average viewer, but by trying to hang a lantern on it, by lampshading, you made people aware of the thing you're trying to distract them from. If this is a Superman thing, why are you trying to make this the centerpiece of your whole movie? There's a smart way to do this. I don't think lampshading is inherently bad, but I think it is something that's not carefully done most of the times. It can't be a catch-all default approach to your material because then it just becomes self-defeating. You walk away thinking Shazam is as insignificant, uninspired, and unoriginal as the movie is questioning him about. Again, I'm gonna use my classic phrase, it wants to have its cake and eat it too. What makes stories like this work is that the world surrounding our hero is confident and distinct. Spider-Man 2, for example, feels like a Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, confidently so, even more confidently so than that first film, and the hero in flux only makes the journey more specific for them. We have something to latch onto. This feels like it could be a Shazam-specific crisis of identity, but here they sort of lose the charm of the original, the simplicity of a child with godlike powers who transforms into a man in a big city like Philadelphia with a hint of Amblin horror and darkness to give it a bit of an edge that pairs nicely with the idea of kids discovering magic and growing up. The first movie had a distinct thing going for it. It had some teeth, but here, it's largely lost in favor of the more grand-scale mythic stuff. And that's fine, but it definitely removes a lot of the charm and identity. So what we get is a film that doesn't really have a distinct identity, a hero that's going through a crisis of identity and whose existence is solely reliant on what's come before. And that all gets lost in the shuffle of another big budget, massive scale superhero story that could easily just be a Wonder Woman movie or whatever with a new coat of paint. It becomes unremarkable. Here's the thing that makes this even more frustrating. The core idea that Billy really focuses on, the idea of, without my family, I am nothing, is really special and unique. It makes this version of the character pop in a way the people he's compared to don't necessarily. It's an interesting way to be a hero because he doesn't hold the weight of the world on his shoulders alone. He didn't hesitate to share his powers with his siblings. He wanted to share them so everyone could feel as empowered as he did. Billy believes everyone deserves power. Everyone has the capacity for good. You just have to unlock it. I think that's beautiful, even if all of the siblings, when they have their powers, feel samey and Billy sort of gets lost in the mix, which I know thematically is kind of the point. He's not above all of them, but that being said, when you're adding that into the mix with this whole lampshading of, oh, you're just a Superman Wonder Woman ripoff, I mean, again, the character just becomes non-existent. There's a way to get this point across and still have a central protagonist you're basing the story around, and the way to do that is to make each of the siblings have a different ability. I mean, Shazam is an acronym. Pair each sibling with one of the abilities in the acronym, and then Billy can have the full set because the wizard directly imparted that power to him. I don't know, this is where you don't have to follow the comics directly. You can tweak some things to make these characters stand out. And so then the question becomes, is Shazam even a character that can sustain a franchise within the DC universe? Is he someone that needed a sequel? I think we can look to the comics to figure this one out. Shazam hasn't been able to really support a full ongoing comic line in some time. He's had some miniseries, but mostly the character is showing up in Justice League books, and that's not a bad thing. His most famous story is Kingdom Come, which is an Elseworld story about Superman. He couldn't even sustain comics. That's not to say they shouldn't have made an original Shazam movie, but maybe it didn't need to be a franchise?
What? What the fuck?
Some of these guys are supporting characters, and that's okay. When you're approaching these lower tier characters, you need to come into it with a compelling idea. Let creativity lead the way. It just reeks a bit of studios franchising every single ounce of comic book material they can. We've arrived at this point in commercialization, and just because you can't come up with an idea for a sequel doesn't mean the character is finished. It's just their world perhaps doesn't need or require an entire film devoted to it. There's tons of lore associated with the character of Shazam, and that is being confused with the character needing a sequel. But the problem becomes that character gets buried under the weight of the lore. Look at Thor, which I would argue the Shazam films closely resemble-ish. He's in an abyss of his own lore and struggles to have a firm grasp of who the character is. Honestly, those movies really suffer from the same issues that Shazam Fury of the Gods suffers from, although they suffer from it a lot worse because we're not going to talk about the Thor movies here. We're only 2 movies into this potential Shazam franchise, but every film is an attempt to find Shazam's identity because the filmmakers don't know what his identity is other than what it is in relation to everything around him, and they don't even know what they're looking for either. At a certain point, it's like, are we watching every draft you had for a Shazam movie? I need a bit of commitment from you here. David F. Sandberg, who I love as a filmmaker, had a really compelling idea for an initial Shazam movie, something he related to directly, dealing with found family, foster family, and all that stuff. It helped make that first Shazam movie so distinct and beautiful and emotional, and it worked. It felt like he had a story to tell, and I think they probably should have just stopped there. They didn't need to go on with a sequel, and especially with the actors growing older, it's kind of hard to keep making a movie about this thing when your actors have kind of aged out of the roles. And so instead of making a second Shazam movie just because the first one was one of your most critically lauded films at that time, perhaps you should have found ways to integrate Shazam into other movies as well. I mean, this is where the Shazam versus Black Adam thing would have actually helped make this movie better. And unfortunately, with all of this stuff in flux, it makes one of the biggest issues in that first film even bigger here. The biggest identity crisis in this movie is between Billy and Shazam, because Zachary Levi and Asher Angel are on totally separate pages with what they're doing with this character. 2 separate actors bringing something entirely different to the role. That makes it all just feel off. When Asher is on screen as Billy, it's clear that he is really struggling internally to keep his family together. He's terrified of losing them, and there's a real maturity to it all. He feels like a natural evolution of the Billy we met in the first movie. Still not fully an adult, but someone who is coming more to terms with the power he has been granted as the champion of Shazam. But then when Zachary Levi is on screen, it's just not that at all. When Kid Billy becomes more mature, Levi needs to become more mature to reflect, and for fuck's sake, he dies and is resurrected in the same movie. He shouldn't be making Deadpool kitty jokes and all that after he came of age. There's a weird disconnect between the character and Levi's performance. Asher and Levi just don't feel like they're on the same page. Their process should have been crafting a performance that felt singular, that was in line with what each of them is doing, instead of 2 separate ones. I get Shazam is the mask and it allows Billy to loosen up, but that rationalization is never really established. it's coming at the same idea from different angles. Asher plays the character far more nuanced. In Shazam 2, they really just take the shtick that Levi did in the first one, lashed onto it, and ran with it. It becomes a bit one note. And this was a problem in the first film, but I think we were able to overlook it because the rest of the movie was so good, and the difference in performances wasn't as strikingly different as it is here. Levi just feels like he's playing a 10-year-old, not someone on the verge of being 18. Now, comparing this to the responsibility of our villains does show the interesting layers the filmmakers were trying to get across. The gods are almost afraid of the humans using their gifts as they used to, and what that could mean for them. It's a shoes on the other foot moment. Shazam is struggling to find a name because he doesn't entirely know who he is. Even the film sort of plays around with that, with every person basically calling him something different, a former name for the character like Captain Marvel. This is addressed at the end of the film when the wizard basically says his name was right in front of him the whole time. His name is Shazam. The daughters of Atlas had their father's lifeblood stolen from them and therefore feel as though they've lost their identity, have lost the very essence of who they are. But, as we see with Anthea, even when she loses her power, what makes her her is her. It's not her power. I get how this sort of ties into the hodgepodge of influences going on here, but that rings a bit hollow when Billy and Shazam doesn't necessarily have too distinct of an idea, especially with Levi playing the character so kiddie. And then again, back to the lampshading. It's a beautiful message of embracing individualism. I just wish the film was more interested in that idea from a filmmaking and character perspective. It's also a bit at odds with itself. It's talking about individuality, self-discovery, grappling with imposter syndrome, and yet once Billy discovers himself, it's like, don't be afraid to ask for help? Is the point to not go it alone? Or learn to take flight by yourself but never forget the ground from whence you came? It's a bit muddled. These stories that don't need to go bigger and do too much, losing itself in the process. The ambition becomes way bigger than the means. The personal family touch is what has made the Shazamly so special for all their years in the comics, and having this homogeneity on the screen takes it all away. The film also, in trying to juggle all of this, really does lose perspective on Shazam himself. It feels like they wanted to make a movie about Freddy and Captain Marvel Jr., aka Adam Brody, aka the best part of this movie. We focus on Freddy wanting to rebel from the group and go out on his own and be a hero on his own terms. If we were able to dial into that dynamic of Billy and Freddy and the fear of loss, it would have had so much more weight to it. Maybe there could have been a limit on how much Shazam can spread his power. Make it so that the team is just Shazam, Captain Marvel Jr. What the hell do they call him now? Shazam Jr.? I mean, and Mary Marvel. It would then more directly compare with the Daughters of Atlas. Freddy is already relating to Anthea because they feel smothered by their more controlling siblings. This really has some devastating effects when you're the Daughters of Atlas bickering over what to do about the future of your world. Anthea sees the good in people and doesn't wish to eradicate them like Calypso. Even Hespera doesn't want to kill another world. She just wants to protect her own. And in turn, you can have the potential of losing that family dynamic on the line, that connection that is so important to the Shazamly. The story of Shazam is always one that can be related to by anyone. Finding your maturity and understanding how to share your love with the world is something so many people struggle with, and being able to see a hero who gives us a guiding light is amazing. And this movie isn't all that bad. There's some fine jokes and the action is fun enough. The final battle, especially between Shazam and Calypso, was actually pretty epic. There's some cool splash page looking shots and it echoes the climax of Batman v Superman, even down to Billy's sacrifice and resurrection. It's cute, but again, I don't think that excuses this film's overall lack of identity. And without that identity and focus on what makes Shazam special, why should we even care?